Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everybody all over the world. I'm William Rengelink. I worked 10 years at a company called TBA in the Netherlands. Spent some time at Maasvlakte 2, spent some time in Sweden, and have been involved during all those years in various automation projects. And not only container terminals, but also other industries. And emulation has been through those years more or less a standard part of my work. And I think that's also why I give my keynote speech about that. So very brief agenda. What is emulation? There are still many beliefs about what is emulation and what is not. I will try to explain what I understand underneath it, and it's not an absolute truth. So you can have different visions on that. We'll go into a few examples of other industries. I will also show a little movie. Emulation isn't great. It is a very good tool, but it's not perfect. So there are also things you can. There are some things which I believe you can't do with it. It also has some pitfalls. And that brings me then in the end, what does automation in fact require, and why is emulation then maybe a good or not such a good solution? So yeah, let's start with definitions. So I just did some Googling for what's now an emulator, and you find some interesting things on the net. And there you also see that emulation is not new. It's already it's 40 years old. And the interesting thing is a number of different definitions came up with it's copying the behavior of another person. That's what our fellows in Cambridge thinks about it. Technopedia says it's imitate the functions of another computer system. So it means emulation is often used. You can nowadays still play the old games on an emulator of an old computer. And the last one, and that's in fact a change. Originally, the emulator was more hardware, and now an emulator is more often referred to software. What was very interesting when I looked it up at one of the websites, the first thing that really appealed to me is the title where emulator was pushed. The emulator was for some reason pushed underneath risk management, and that struck me. And at the same time, it doesn't surprise me. Many people have asked over the past 15 years that I've been involved with emulation, why do it? And I often told them it's like an insurance company. It's an insurance agreement that you sign at the beginning of your project to limit your risks. So I found it very interesting that on this website, emulator was pushed under risk management. I thought it was a good thing, and apparently it was already done in 2017. So as I said, although we speak about the future, emulation has been there for some time. So what do I mean with an emulator in the context of the rest of this presentation? I mean, in fact, an emulator that represents the physical world. So that's a model that contains an accurate description of manual or automated equipment, including its drivers, operators with respect to handling containers. You model the real world, you model the movement of the boxes. And we will also see some examples of another industry where it's not boxes. And what is key is that this emulator, it interacts to the control systems. It can be the TOS, the ECS, or both, whatever the setup is that you have. But it's key that it interacts really in the same way as the real world from a technical protocol and interaction protocol. So there should be no difference. And I believe anecdotes are always doing well. When the first time I built a emulator for a baggage handling system, and I remember one of the key designers of that company, software developers, he was really thrilled simply to see that his PLC could control this virtual conveyor and that it would stop as soon as the baggage piece was touching the sensor and his program responded. And he was really thrilled. That's now about 16 or 17 years ago, but it is really that key, right? You have an emulator, it's a tool, and it switches. One moment the real system is speaking to the TOS or the ECS, whatever, and the next thing it's speaking to your virtual environment. And what is the last thing that for me is key is randomness. You might mean, what do you mean with that? The nice thing about emulation, and that is where it really differentiates from scripts, is that there is randomness. That means your key cranes won't all do the beautiful static cycle of say 90 seconds per cycle. No, there are going to be variations. There are going to be variations in driving behavior. There are going to be different deviations in handling times. It's going to take a little bit more time or less time to put the container on the ground. And those, although they have no direct software effect, what they will do is that there will be a different sequence, or that there can exist a different sequence in which certain messages are sent to the upper level systems. And exactly that is really key. And that is different than a script, because in a script there is a certain sequence that you follow, and especially with emulation, you have a beautiful solution to create this randomness. And I think that is key. So to give an example, and as said, you can build it in a different way. So, but for me, the usual way I look at emulations, especially in our field of industry, there is a terminal operating system or an ECS, and it's connected in reality to a key crane or OCR, the key crane driver. To a stacking crane, it can be automated, it can be perpendicular, it can be whatever kind of stack, to a strad or a truck, to your gate. And key is it has a terminal layout. And your emulator is the gray box, as you see blended in here. And that represents, in fact, the full world as it happens. So you can model a container coming in via the gate, in the end, all the way to being loaded by the key crane. So that's our industry. So how is it in other industries? And I will show you a little movie. This is a movie made at Schiphol Airport. And I need to tell you, this movie is also old. And this was made 10 years ago when Schiphol was investing in Maxibus. And Maxibus is a system that they use to test the full baggage handling. So it's important to understand Schiphol Airport has multiple terminals, and all those baggage handling systems are connected. So that means that as if you would have multiple container facilities managed by one TOS, this baggage handling system is managed by multiple systems, and there is one overlaying. And what they wanted to have, that's what they called Maxibus, was actually a solution where they could mimic each and every PLC in the system so that it could test the overall solution. I'll try to switch now to a movie. This is Mr. Bert Driver. He is the test manager of, at that time, of Schiphol Airport. And he was, in fact, so he was the direct client of, to test to have Maxibus.
Wat gaan we doen hier, Bert?
We gaan een loadtest nadoen vanaf de losskades 1 en 2 centraal, met als eindbestemming dat wil zijn de E-kelder.
Oké, en zien we dat hier op het scherm? Koffers die je ziet gaan?
Ja, dat zijn koffers die je ziet gaan. En daar zie je de pre-sorter en de kleurtjes geven aan wat de bestemming van die koffer is.
Oké.
So maybe to stop really briefly. So where we are in is really in the basement of Schiphol Airport. And there they have rebuilt this Maxibus, so this full virtual test setup, and you see, in fact, all the actual control views for the baggage handling system, and they're going to do a test. You heard the term lateral, that means it's a destination. So that's where the baggage in the end is unloaded on a cart.
Ik weet je op deze manier mooi volgen.
Oké, en hoe zou je dit gedaan hebben als je geen Maxibus had?
Met het echte systeem.
So this is how testing was done at Schiphol Airport in the past. And just also for your information, it's not only how it's done at Schiphol, but also at many other sites.
Wat de voordelen zijn van Maxibus ten opzichte van testen in het echte systeem?
Ja, dat kan ik wel. We zitten nu hier in deze ruimte. In plaats dat we koffers lopen te gooien. We hebben hier meteen het overzicht van de hele area. Je kan daar de pre-sorters zien. Je kan de online zien. Je kan daar de main sorters zien. De kleur de kleur wordt aangegeven wat de bestemming van de koffer is. Nou goed, we zitten nu met 2 mensen aan het testen. En anders heb je er gewoon heel veel meer mensen nodig. En het kost wat inspanning. En verder is het nu gewoon overdag in plaats van 's avonds. Dus er zijn gewoon heel wat voordelen te benoemen. Ja. Oh, ik zie.
Now he's going to tell us that the test in fact failed. So that's where I skip. But exactly that's why you test, right? And that's why in fact emulation is a very powerful tool. What is key and why I shared this movie, it's already 10 years ago. I just want to show emulation is in other industries. So even for baggage handling systems, but also for warehouses, etc. It is standard. I just pulled also some, it's always good to use, to look on the web and see what's going around. You see that emulation is now also really standard and used by suppliers for large warehouses. So and there is a reason, and I think Bert really explained the reasons really properly. It is much easier to test. So it is, for me, it's not a question. And I think these examples also show it's not a question. It is just the way to do it. See if we can go to the next slide. So can you do anything then? Can you do everything with emulation, or are there limitations? And I think that's always good to be clear, and maybe the speakers later on, I saw they will also share their experiences with emulation. So I hope they will disagree with me, but let's see. So what is clearly possible? What is absolutely possible is that you can really run an 8-hour operation with all flows active simultaneously. So your gate running, your water side running, everything at the same time. But I would like to add to that happy operation. So that means all the happy flows. What can you also do is really verify if you get a new software release. Just run it through an emulation. Just see, are there any major flaws? If it worked with the previous release, there should be no reason why it doesn't with this one. And that's often the whole testing process of new software releases is labor intensive, as was also pointed out by Schiphol Airport. That's something that you can really do. What is also possible, all the operational settings. So if we look at a TOS, all the settings that you can change and have an immediate effect now, for example, by changing certain logic, changing certain preferences, blocking certain areas, all those settings you theoretically can test now. And the nice thing is that you really train people behind the actual control screens. So the people have the same work environment as they will have when your system is ready, when your automation is ready, when you go live. The real beauty is that theoretically you can run unattended. But I made a small disclaimer with it because emulation is not very forgiving. And what do I mean with that? The emulation responds to the orders it gets. So if there is something not perfectly working in the TOS or the ECS and there is an incorrect order, the vehicle will get stuck or something else will get stuck. And then the experiment at a certain moment starts to deteriorate because one crane will stop and 2 cranes will stop. In the worst case, all your key cranes will stop. So that is something important to realize. That makes it also really powerful to verify, hey, is everything still working? But at the same time, it also means you can reach the level of unattended, but it's not easy. So what is maybe possible? You can execute exception scenarios. It's perfectly possible, but you need to define those as well. Why? The emulation often is using the same interfaces. However, not always the case that the emulator also supports all the exception cases that can happen in reality. Why? Because there will be an interaction in reality. There will be a sequence of messages be exchanged, or there might be even verbal communication to fix something. That exception you can't easily fix unless it is built in the emulator in advance. So if you want to do that, think about it before you start, and be aware it will take development at the emulator side. What is really tough? Can you do emulation over 3 weeks? For example, I think what is key for all of us is, of course, your decking strategy. Some people call it stacking strategy. How do I put my containers over in the yard over time? How do I test that? My personal opinion, and I'll say this is my personal opinion, is that it's really tough to use emulation to do that. Why is that? Because you run an experiment of a day, then you need to replan again, then you need to, because you continuously get new data, you get new ships in. So you really need to put a lot of effort in it, as much effort as in real operations. And the core thing is the system, the TOS and the emulator, they must run flawless over time. So I think that is really tough. It's not impossible. Maybe somebody is going to tell you today that it's easy. I think personally that for that there is always another need to have a different form of testing for the decking algorithms over the longer time. Just as a note, I now speak about full terminal emulation. You can also use, and I think you should, and I think it's also getting to be the standard, that you should use emulation if you have an automated key crane or remote automated or an automated yard crane. Also for those you can build an emulator, a real emulator that is connected to the PLC controls of the crane, and in that way you can test it. It's the same technique, but it's a different model, and you will also buy it most likely from your equipment supplier or the integrator. Are there any pitfalls? The simple thing is yes. So emulation is not off the shelf. So what anybody might also tell you, it is not just buy and go. And why is that? It is still a software product, and you need to configure it. It needs to be the exact right layout. The interaction and the behavior needs to be perfect. If you, of course, are using a tool that already has been pre-integrated with the same TOS, then you will know that the interaction with the TOS is very likely to be complete. However, it needs to be verified and it needs to be right. So the pitfall is assuming I just buy an emulator and it's done. No, it will take time to configure it, and it will take time, and it also means that you will need to know all the interfaces, all the details to build the model right. The other nice pitfall, and I've heard this complaint over the years often, this only happens in emulation. So there is a bug, your emulation stops, and then you get feedback. Yeah. No, this doesn't happen in reality. So the emulator is wrong. And that complaint is most often seen when you start also to emulate manned equipment. For example, if you have strats and AECs or trucks and AECs, then it's like, no, it doesn't happen. The truth is, in fact, it will also happen in the field, but people are used to certain behavior. If you have a screen and something happens on it, they will fix it. They will just retry, or they will call inside, somebody will reset it. There won't be an issue or a ticket created. It does happen, but the emulation is simply a bit more unforgiving, because if the emulator is not prepared for it, it will stop. Then the toughest thing is, do you also trust the results of the emulator? So your emulation might run, or it might not run. It might only run 4 hours. Then you run into all kind of issues. There still might be all kind of pressure in your project to deploy the software in production. I think the only thing that is really simple is if the emulation doesn't run, it will fail in production too. So you will get the same amount of issues, at least, that you have seen in the emulator. You will also see them outside. So make sure that you're convinced about the tool and please listen to the results of it as well. What is the last pitfall? Assume that by emulation you will need less time. I think the thing is that you shift time. So you will still need the time to test, but it will allow you to test earlier. So you don't need to have all the equipment on site. You can do it earlier. So having said that, what is then the link with automation and emulation? And so maybe what does it mean if you in fact introduce automation? And I'll just make a new number of statements and you feel free to disagree. But what it really means is that you will have a new standard process, and that must be very robust, because by automating there is usually less ability to bypass the process. You will most likely introduce technical interfaces between systems that you didn't have before you had radio or different ways to solve systems. Now you will have technical interfaces, and they can fail, and they will fail. Maybe not the first day, but there will be glitches. So you need to have a robust solution for that. Very often there will be new end-to-end processes, also for operations. So that means people need to be trained in following these processes. Consequence is very often that there is new logic in the TOS, or some projects will even require the introduction of an ECS. So that means there is going to be introduced a lot of software with new functionality. And I think I would like to add to that, even if it is new logic, there can also be existing logic in the TOS, but if it's not used anywhere else, there is no guarantee that it works. There will be exceptions. It's not a question whether there will be, it's the question how many, and it's the question how do you deal with them. And most important thing to realize is that there will be a more complex chain for solving this. So you cannot just simply use the radio. You will need to follow a sequence of steps in your systems, most likely, to resolve the issue. And the last thing, there will be expectations in any automation project. You will deal with senior management and other management levels looking at you, looking at your project, and it really needs to work. So the core question is how to test enough. Right. So then making the bridge, automation and emulation. For me, it's very simple. I chose not to use a soccer goal, by the way, but it's very simple. Automation and emulation belong together. And how complex it needs to be all depends on your project. But I dare to state that I would not do an automation project with a form of emulation. Having said that, how do you then implement it? Because it's easy to say, okay, we go for emulation. Then maybe still good to remember, emulation is not perfect. So it will also not solve everything. There are limitations to the solution, as I said before, and it's also not the magic stick that will make sure that your testing time is reduced. It is shifted. So what is key? First, and I write here TOS, it can also be ECS, it can be anything. Key is that you select your emulation vendor when you select the TOS. So that means you need to reserve budget on your side. But at the same time, also the TOS vendor, and that's, I think it's really interesting that also Mr. Yip, I think from TSB is joining here and tells his story. Because I think also the TOS vendor, it's really important that he knows that you're gonna emulate in your project, or the ECS vendor, and that you expect him to be involved in this integration. So it will take also time from him to be part of the integration, and you will find bugs in a different stage of the project. And there you will also expect him to respond quickly, otherwise you will still not be successful. Since emulation is not over-encompassing, it is part of your testing strategy. However, it is not everything. So you still must, or you mustn't do anything, but you still need to think about scripted testing. So having automated test, manual testing, and outside testing. But emulation is one of the elements in it that you need to embed. Creating an owner, and that can be IT, it can be ops, it can be QA, for emulation. What do I mean with that? Emulation is not something just for the project. I think in most cases, emulation is used years after. I was lucky this year to visit one of the terminals where we implemented emulation by now 14 years ago, and they still use it. So 14 years after the project went live, they still use it to test each and every TOS release they get from the vendor. And it still has value. So it's really important that you embed it in your organization, that somebody owns it. Of course, you can also decide to outsource if you say we only need it for the project. That's also, it is an option. Plan the time. That's, I think, the last advice that I have is if the functionality is new or unused, it will take time. So again, the emulator needs to be configured or built, and also there is a lead time. So just consider, although emulation, in my opinion, is needed in case of automation, it does take time and you need to reserve the time for it. And I think the other examples from the other industries also really show it's not a choice to use emulation. I think it is a must-have.